Thank you very much indeed. Good evening. I have a very long association and great admiration of the Asia Society, not least some of the greatest people that one way or another I've worked with in my career have gone on to join in one way or another the Asia Society. Most of the people who served with the British Foreign Office one way or another turn up at the Asia Society. With Tata, my relationship goes back a very long way, and Tata were instrumental in establishing what I probably quite incorrectly call the Nobel Prize for Engineering, which is the Queen Elizabeth Prize for Engineering, and I'm chairman of the foundation of that. But Tata were quite instrumental in that. And I think it demonstrates just merely one aspect of what is such a great global enterprise that Tata is now and has been for a very long time. So thank you to both of them. It's a great pleasure to be here. So I thought rather than give formal remarks, which I really can't stand doing, that's best done in the House of Lords, not done anywhere else. And sometimes they have no impact because they are formal. Everyone knows what they are before you give them. I thought I'd this evening just talk about four things. First, define what I mean by engineering and why this book has an extraordinary work of art on its cover. Secondly, talk a little bit about what the global benefits and why we ignore them. Thirdly, I want to talk about intended and unintended consequences. And finally, just something on innovation. And since I'm going to spend 5 minutes doing it, it'll be pretty light touch. So first, engineering. I've always thought that engineering is a bit like the ancient god Janus. Janus has two faces, very unusual thing. One face looking into the past and one into the future. Remember the past and the future. I think engineering sits between discovery, so things that are discovered in the laboratory or elsewhere, and then on the other side, society and markets. So I regard discoveries as things of the past, they have been discovered, and the markets and humanity is something of the future, because you're never quite sure what's going to happen when you do something with humanity. And engineering sits in the middle here, and it transforms, it does an extraordinary thing, transforming an idea or a discovery into something that moves the world in one way or another. And I think that is the definition I've used. And in my book, I've taken the liberty of talking about all the different components of that I've been involved in, whether it is biomedical engineering. I'm chairman of the Crick Institute in London. It's a very great institute. It's one of the places where we have 4 Nobel laureates on staff and 25 fellows of the Royal Society as well. So it's trying to work out not how to solve cancer, but why cancers occur. A very deep problem indeed that people don't fully understand. Right through to my day job, which has been my day job for a long time, which is how to provide energy to the world. So I thought I'd take people on a tour and take them into different rooms with different people who were experts in different areas, and have a conversation with them and try and put a human face onto something that doesn't sometimes feel very human, which is engineering, progress and advancement. So that's what I tried to do, and let's see if we can make it sound human tonight. But the second point is that the benefits are very human. People look at engineering and say, yes, but it's just a pursuit. But actually it's not. It's a generator of benefits and advancement. And that's why I think it is the foundation of all civilization. You may disagree with that. But what it's done is it has enabled people to go from mere survival to the generation of new things and a new future, progress. by making people healthier, live longer, connect them, educate them, and actually make even the world a less violent place over time. Remarkably, the world is less violent today than it has been for a very, very long time. But engineering has, like many pursuits, intended consequences. People want to do something, and it also has unintended consequences. When they do something, something else happens. And my story, I picked one story tonight, and it's about 5G communication. So in order to create more competition in the United States, the government of the US decided to break up a telephone company called AT&T into its components, which it did, and it created a lot of competition. Actually, it turns out that AT&T today is bigger than it was before it was broken up, but that's another matter. One of the components it broke up is something called Bell Laboratories. Bell Laboratories was a Nobel Prize factory, and it produced amazing things. But it was sold, and it was sold again and again, and eventually ended up in the hands of some not very strong companies. So today, as it turns out, the US has, as a result of that, no 5G technology. It's in the hands of a Finnish company, a Swedish company, and most importantly, a very large Chinese company, Huawei. This has caused the US to think, did we mean it? Surely we wanted to be number one in all technologies, all engineering technologies that attend to security and defense and communication, which is what the US had a doctrine so to do. As a result of this, they've got a greatly competitive telephone system, but they don't have 5G. We can come back to that later. My final point is about innovation and the consequences. I think if we look at my own business, which is oil and gas, we see that, as I think I gave a speech 22 years ago, saying the oil and gas industry is accountable for climate change and needs to do something to change what it's doing. We've come a long way since then, and nothing much has happened, really. A lot of rhetoric, not a lot of change, and a lot more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and a threat, an existential threat to the world. So the question is what to do. Abolish oil and gas, or create some other way of taking the carbon out of oil and gas. That's where innovation really must go, because if you look at the world, no one, I think, is going to agree to take oil and gas out of the system, not yet anyway. I think my friends in Saudi Arabia would certainly disagree with that. My final point is, people ask me, why is the book called Make, Think, Imagine? Surely it should be Imagine, Think, Make. And I say to people, well, I've partly done it to annoy people so that they actually ask this question. But actually I've taken one particular case, which is a very important one, which is the case of Monsieur Carnot. And Carnot was a French physicist, engineer, and he looked at steam engines and said, I wonder how they work. People had made the steam engines, and he said there must be more to it than just watching these things pumping away. And he realized that, of course, there were rules and laws that affected how this mechanism worked. In other words, why it wasn't perpetual motion in particular. So in observing this, he came up with a very big idea that time moves in one direction only, and things get more chaotic over time. It is, of course, the second law of thermodynamics, which is the single most, probably arguably, one of the most important laws anyone ever came up with. And Mr. Carnot didn't sit in a darkened room and work it out. He actually looked at what was made steam engine, then he thought about it, and he imagined a future. So to me, that says something about what we should do today as a civilization. I want to stop there because that seems to me the most interesting thing is a conversation, if that's all right with you.
Thank you, Lord Browne. I first want to say a warm welcome to everyone for being with us tonight. I think some of you managed through some difficult traffic, so thank you for bearing with that and making it here. Welcome, Lord Browne. We're so very honored to have you with us and excited to be part of your book launch. I have thoroughly enjoyed reading it.
Thank you.
So I'm ready to get into some of the questions. You know, in reading the book, it covers such a wide expanse of history and innovation. I went through the book and I learned everything from the inner workings of satellites and MRI machines all the way down to ballpoint pens, which I had never thought about as an engineering feat. So in going through all of these examples, I just want to read one of the quotes that was brought up in the middle of your book. And I think you were quoting someone else who said, looking at the history of it, the thing that strikes me most clearly is how quickly things have moved on from being a dangerous and outlandish technology to being generally accepted. And so I was just wondering, as you went through all of these different examples over time, what's your favorite example of this?
I think my favorite example is probably the use of robots to operate on human beings. I think no one would have really allowed themselves to be looked at by a machine that goes inside a body until they realized how extraordinary it was and how it could do things which no human can do. Now, it's obviously controlled by a human, but it can operate in a very small way and not affect nerves. It was a very great surgeon, friend of mine, who said, you need to understand when you join the CRIC that surgeons are a member of the craft organization. We're craftsmen, we're not necessarily scientists, and therefore he said we're closer to engineers, which I thought was an interesting way. He said, and the thing is that our engineering requires us to cut things open. And if we can reduce the size of the cut and clean it and sew it up very quickly, this will reduce risk hugely. And machines will do that. Now, I think if you'd gone back 20 years ago and said to someone, a machine will take care of you, they'll say, actually, I want a surgeon. I want someone to speak to me. And I think there's a big change. There are plenty of other things. And actually, we go backwards. Just to pick another medical example. One of the great things we invented were vaccines and antibacterials and things like that. Nowadays, there's a very big rejection in some quarters of society of vaccines. They were regarded as very safe, but now some people regard them as dangerous. The reverse has happened. As a result, they've become very antisocial. Measles outbreaks in New York City, with people who are not vaccinated for measles. It's wrong, but danger goes in cycles, it seems to me. We'll see what happens with autonomous vehicles, but that's a very different one.
Actually, so I have another example related to this, and it's about the whole conversation around big tech.
Yep.
So, when you're talking about different reactions socially to what are essentially engineering innovations, given how important engineering is, what has happened in the translation of that to the society at large to be able to understand the consequences, good or bad, of what comes of it? I mean, in thinking of the backlash to big tech, where do you fall on this debate of what they could have done better or whether it's well-deserved?
Let's pick one thing and see if we can elaborate. It strikes me that one of the things that we need to stop happening is simply the thought that if something can be done, it is done, rather than if something can be done, let's think about whether we should do it. Can and should are two different things. And how do we teach people, how do we educate people about how to deal with the should? On an individual basis, to do with value systems and purpose, on a group basis, to do with supervision, on a corporate basis, to do with boards of directors, and on a national basis, to do with regulation and law. So I think these layers are very important. Now, what I think big tech did, Facebook, it clearly was driven by, if we can do it, let's do it, and we'll take care of the consequences. There were some very, very badly judged quotes, which I put in the book, about, well, if we kill someone on the way, it doesn't really matter. No, it matters a lot. It matters hugely, because it's an indicator of danger. And so I think we've got to think about consequence very, very carefully indeed. Now, as a result, there's a significant backlash. I'm much more in favor of what happened to Microsoft. So Microsoft, without the US government intervening and saying, Microsoft, you can't go into the business of populating the internet exclusively with search engines, we would never have Google or Facebook. They didn't do anything other than stop them doing something. They chilled down the activity. So I'm all in favor of that. I'm not sure I like de facto single choice operators of anything. So I'm in favor of a degree of repackaging of these organizations. How to do it? There are probably plenty of ways. As being in an industry which has both been vertically and horizontally cut to bits in order to increase competition, I'm all in favor of doing that, in my view.
I think this question of policymaking then becomes really important. And I think it's relevant to the Indian context as well, in the sense of who should be at the table when we are making these policies, and perhaps on timing. Is it just an issue of getting the right people, engineers, civil society, whoever it might be, earlier on in the decision-making rather than looking backwards?
So regulation usually, of course, is a lagging activity. Something has to happen in order for regulation to take place. But let me talk about, I think, first I'd like to talk about the table. I've spent a long time in part of an industry which is called energy. Energy is the world's largest business. It's essential for all forms of progress, and it's something not everybody on this planet actually still has access to. So a lot of people who don't have access to energy. Energy is not just oil, gas, and coal, it's other things as well. But today, 86% of your energy is generated from primary sources, which are hydrocarbons. Now, we can talk later about what we do, but let's suppose, though, if the people who produce oil and gas and coal say, well, that's it, since you've got no choice, you have to use us, we'll carry on doing what we're doing, blind to the impact on the environment, they become both passively aggressive, just carry on, and actually they defend their position a bit too strongly. They actually defend it by saying, well, it's your problem. It's a bit like cigarettes, The tobacco companies used to say, we produce tobacco, we produce cigarettes, but we don't smoke them, which was kind of true, but not necessarily relevant. So in regulation, I think it's very necessary to be a participant in the regulation of your activity. But in order to do so, I think you genuinely have to believe that stakeholders manage you. You do not manage stakeholders. And I think that's really important. So regulation is enormously important because it covers the common good, but it lags usually some bad things that happen to society. I think a weak form of activity, therefore, has to be the education of critical participants in innovation activity. And I do think that's important. I think educating people on what it does mean to have, for example, values, what it does mean to have purpose, and why they're kind of important, because it makes you part of society if you agree and you follow these things. That's important. Secondly, I think it's important in a corporate setting to have very strong enforcement of supervision in this area, that if people break values, they've broken an implied contract with the firm, and therefore it's a question of whether they should be there or be somewhere else. And then boards of directors, I've always believed, should be not pure subject matter experts of the firm. They should be broad enough to be experts on the society within which the firm is operating, as well as the firm itself. And by taking a broader view, you can say, wait a minute now, why should I be doing this? You know, I understand my business requires me to make these goods and services, but I need to deliver them in a different way. I need to agree. And then finally, it is regulation and then the law to enforce. But regulation probably takes more than one go to get right. If you look at a lot of regulation, it is always corrected because of the, you can't write a perfect contract, and that's it.
Someone on my team always talks about regulatory sandboxes as one of the ways going forward. So maybe more of that needs to take place.
I think so. But I do think if you can, there's such a big problem with vested interests and lobbying and biased activity and biased use of data. But I think if we can try and push for more exposition of transparency, the better off we are. And I think there are plenty of tools and techniques, again, engineering tools and techniques. I was in Abu Dhabi, again, talking about this with the energy industry. And it is to note that nowadays it is very possible to measure carbon dioxide emissions by processing satellite signals. Very soon you'll be able to you'll have enough data to know exactly who's doing what. So there will be no hiding place. You can't say, well, I didn't actually generate it. The answer is you either did or you didn't, to a reasonably high degree of probability. Equally, one of the ways of absorbing carbon dioxide, a favorite one, has been to take forests and maintain them in their state forever. So this is possible, but it doesn't happen everywhere. And the big question always has been is, well, how many trees are there actually in the forest? Now you can count them exactly. So if you decide to use one of these things as an absorber of carbon dioxide, you know what you're doing and you can actually enforce the promises people have made. Again, by imaging from satellite, and you measure the volume of trees exactly.
So you've been bringing up examples related to climate change. I want to ask you a little bit about this. I'm sure it can't be avoided. But I want to start at what I think is the beginning. I'm sure it wasn't the beginning for you. But if we go back to 1997, and I'm fascinated to read about this story. You were standing at a lectern in Stanford, and you were the first leader of a big oil and gas company, and you argued the case for climate change. Can you just tell me what you were thinking or feeling in the moment?
So, around about 1995, I was appointed CEO of BP, and at the time, I was very interested in talking to people about what was happening post the first Rio conference, about the environment and what was then called global warming, but actually really meant altering the climate. And there was a big weight of scientific literature on this. And I also had inside BP a very large number of earth scientists, and they read this literature. This is what it comes out of the journals that the people in earth science research read the whole time, and they understand it. So I started talking to everyone. They said, we've got a real problem here. It's not for sure. The modelling is odd, but it certainly has clear indications that we're doing something to the world which could be quite irreversible. So based on that, and then listening to people and listening to my team, I decided that we had to do something about this, but in a business-like sense rather than just a policy sense. So we picked some things to do, like establish an internal trading system for carbon to put a price on carbon. So we did that. Tighten up all valves to stop methane leaking into the atmosphere, because that's very dangerous greenhouse gas. Did that. Invest in different sources of energy. We did that. So I decided we would make a statement like this to say, who will follow us? Because it's time for us to get a seat at the table. Because I was concerned that people were going to make decisions without actually talking to us. And I wanted a seat at the table, and I believed it was the right thing to do. So internally, I'd say we got about 70% of the people inside BP agreeing with it, and 30% not. But people who really did agree. And that wasn't bad. If I were running for office on a 70-30 basis, that would be pretty good, I think.
Could be very good.
So that was the start of it all. And the reaction could have been very predictable. The oil and gas industry said, well, they were very polite, but actually this is the message. You are crazy. You are going to destroy the industry, and this is an existential threat that must be fought at all costs. I disagreed with that. The American Petroleum Institute was the leader of the negative activity. So we continued doing things. It proved to be difficult because when the oil industry works in joint ventures and cooperation with people, and some people said, well, if you want to reduce carbon dioxide, you pay 100% of the bill. We won't share in that. So we were faced with some very interesting and awkward decisions. But I think we carried on, and the situation now is very different. I think everyone recognizes in the oil and gas industry that they have a very large problem on their hands. And they have to decide whether or not they treat it in a constructive way. In other words, how do we innovate to take the carbon out of hydrocarbons, or do they resist and hope for the best? I've never liked hoping for the best. It's a nice thing to do right at the end of the chain, but at the beginning, I think you've got to do something different. And we know for sure. So today, I can get a bunch of people, we can design several versions of decarbonisation of hydrocarbons right now. We can do that. They're called carbon capture, storage, carbon capture and use. Whether you take it out of the hydrocarbons before, after you burn it, the technology is known, the places to store it are known, and the number of ways to use carbon dioxide are rising every day. So if you're in the production of hydrocarbons, the first thing you have to do is to begin to think about when will you reduce your emissions by, let's say, 50%, and how do you get this done? Now, that's half the energy problem, because if you look at, as I expect many people to look at the way in which energy is used in the world, I said 86% of primary inputs today are hydrocarbons. There'll probably be 70% in 20 years' time. So everything rises a bit. So it means that for oil and gas, which is not coal as additional, it'll probably be roughly the same production level as it is today in 20 to 25 years' time. So in order to stop CO2 going up big time in the atmosphere, you have to decarbonize hydrocarbons. Meanwhile, you need to also diversify energy sources. And whether that's building more fission nuclear in countries that are prepared to do it, whether it's really innovating in solar to make it even more efficient, wind, biomass, biofuels, hydro, and the storage for intermittent energy sources, that's a very different but vital business also to be in. So this is, I think, the situation that we face today. And to come back to regulation, I do think it's very important that the oil and gas industry, if it really wants to have a future, it needs to be constructive and proactive in trying to solve its problem, rather than defensive or passively aggressive in its attitude towards regulation. Because in order to get this done, it will require getting economic signals through public policy in order to kickstart the process. It cannot be done without that, because the cost of taking carbon out of hydrocarbons is very high. But like all things, mobile phone was a brick. I think some people here remember the very large bricks that we had to carry around. You'll remember also the cost of a solar panel, for some of you, was 250 times what it is today, 40 years ago. Things have a habit of moving ahead. The more you do, so simply the economies of scale and learning curves, and actually optimizing the system. But you've got to start. Someone's got to start. And very often in some of these technology, of course, it was the US government that started. We've got a more complicated situation today, globally.
And so one of the things that you advocate for is a carbon tax. Yeah. How realistic do you see widespread implementation of something like that?
Well, I see, first of all, I don't believe in any form of global anything and when it comes to regulation or taxes. Yeah. So this is nation by nation or region by region. Well, I think the debate is engaged, put it like this. So the debate certainly engaged in the US across both sides of the House of Representatives and Senate. It hasn't passed, but people like George Shultz are promoting a hydrocarbon, a carbon tax that will be recycled to the taxpayer according to household income. So in other words, it becomes a progressive rather than regressive tax. The incoming president of the EU, she is made a number one priority to think of policy instruments to accelerate the decarbonisation of the EU. I think these moves say, I'm hopeful, nothing really exists at the moment. Some does, but it failed. For example, we traded carbon in Europe, but so many exceptions were made to make the market that it shrank and shrank and shrank and became an ineffective signal instrument. But I think the good news is people have learned. And if we are serious that what we're seeing today, both in not just in the theoretical forecasts, which I think are getting better and better about the way in which the Earth's climate will change, but perhaps some local phenomena today that we see that are beginning to say to people, this is unusual. And while records have been kept, we have not seen this before. Whether that's wildfires in Los Angeles. I was in Los Angeles recently. One of the people who interviewed me had to move 3 times, 3 different places in a week with wildfires in the middle of a large metropolitan area. Or whether it's hurricanes being much stronger because the sea is warmer, therefore it's a machine, it takes the energy upwards. In my own case, yesterday, there were record floods in Venice, Italy. So, people are saying, well, don't give me the theory. I think something's going wrong here, and it's about time we did something about it. So the more pressure, the more likely politicians will move. They won't move unless the population makes it a good thing for them to move.
So, John, you're bringing up these examples that are happening in big urban areas, and I think it ties very well into, obviously, a very contemporary debate in India about urban spaces and planning. So when we think about these issues of sustainability, of mobility, that you also bring up in your book, what are some concrete ideas for us in terms of thinking about urban planning in a better way?
So let me preface this by saying I managed to speak to probably some of the greatest architects in the world. And for one reason or other, I know them. And I wanted to talk to them about building materials, whether elevators could be faster and how high could they go. And they courteously talked about that with me. And then all of them, to a woman and man, changed the subject and said, I want to talk to you about how to build a city, because we're doing all the wrong things. We have to get rid of roads. We need to stop too much transportation. I think we can see evidence here. We need to use spaces for agriculture as well as living. We need to stop too many high-rises because they are dehumanizing. And we need to give people freedom of choice on how they make their home wherever possible. You see it even in informal housing, but you also see it where people best look after a place is where they have a say in what's actually done. I spoke to this extraordinary architect, Alejandro Aravena from Chile, who specializes in building houses that are not actually finished, that the owner can decide what to do with some of it. Now, there are rules and regulations because they want the houses burning down with bad electrical fittings and things like that. But it allows people to own something. So all of these are just starter thoughts. But I would say the final point they made, which I think is clear, is that cities which are too planned often fail because they forget that human beings have to be in them. And that's a very long history from the 16th century onwards. Abandoned, planned cities, often by some despot, and they've gone away as a result of that. So I think what I say in the book is the rules we have today don't work. We need to worry very much more about what people do in cities rather than just apply integrated planning, rather than using what we've got today to retrofit cities. And people say, well, you can say that, can't you? Because it will never happen in the UK. The cities there are so old that we can't do anything about them. That's partly true, but actually that's not fully true. It may be true in parts of London or Cambridge or Oxford, but it isn't true in a lot of places. We need to rethink what we do. But I've been interested in this point that the reason why people live close in cities is that they have to get to work in the cities. Let's suppose we could really speed up the communication between different living areas into a city. So rather than take 3 hours to come by train, how about 30 minutes? And I think there's some very interesting thinking going on right now on varieties of things called hyperloops, which are ultra-high-speed trains that work in a partial vacuum because it takes away the resistance of the air, and they can work with passive motivation with magnets. So they use very little energy. These things will, I think, be some of the roads of the future and change the way we can distribute people. I think people would much prefer to live in a less crowded environment generally, but they have to come to places to do certain things, whether it's to give service, to work, something. And so the problem to solve is how do you get from A to B, not necessarily how do you pile up even more people in A.
There's a proposed hyperloop between Mumbai and Pune,
yes.
Right? Yes. Yes, 20 minutes.
Well, I have to confess to being an investor in Hyperloop TNT, because I think while it perhaps will take longer than my active life to get done on a wide scale, I do actually think there's something in here which is very important. Otherwise, we get to the point where it's intolerable for people to live, in my view.
I'm looking at Bunty. Am I allowed 2 questions? And then we'll open it up. One question we definitely have to cover, because the book makes such a big point of this, is that there's this big debate about technology going forward and whether technology is going to take away jobs. So if you could please share your view, because it's such an important part of the book.
In thinking about this, I decided to speak to all my friends who'd won Nobel Prizes in economics, and I concluded that it confused me until I went back to one of my mentors to speak to him, Michael Spence. So I think it's like this, really. I know, let me be the first to say that history doesn't repeat itself. But like a famous American author, I would say it certainly rhymes. So you have to think about why you might work against history. So the data shows that 120 years ago, in the industrialized world of that day, people worked on average about 70 hours a week. And now they work about 35. So something happened to the other 35 hours. First of all, they seem to get paid more on average in the world. And secondly, they did something with the time. When I was at Cambridge in the 60s, I remember going to a huge, important symposium. At least I thought it was very important as a final year undergraduate. But it was called Automation and Computing, What to Do with Leisure Time. And this was in the 60s. So people had contended there that there would be not enough work and we'd have to revitalize our lives. Leisure time would take over. What do we do? The evidence shows that that's not the case. As things change, so everything changes. It's not all other things being equal. So there's innovation in new products, new services, new ways of doing things, new industries. And industries pick up everywhere. I think the example which causes a lot of people thought is when the word saboteur was invented. The hand looms in Manchester, England, were making textiles by hand and employing people in terrible conditions. And then suddenly it was automated. And they said, we're going to lose our jobs. Actually, the number of people involved in the textile industry as a result of the invention of automation at that time, so this is in the Victorian period, went up by a factor of 10, I think it was. So I think there are a lot of things that change and there are a lot of things that we will do. Public policy has to move. Certainly in the UK, everyone's engaged with, if the work week stops, does that mean everyone will earn less? Or do we put the rates up per hour? Obviously, public policy has a say in that. You have to figure out how to do this. And then what else can we do? What are the new things of the future? There are plenty. There are plenty of things. We may displace one job, but we get another. Autonomous vehicles will one day when they actually work, they don't work at the moment, but one day if they work, they'll change the nature of driving. But so too will change the nature of supervision, and a variety of other things will happen. So I don't buy this idea that technology drives people into areas where there's no work and the social structures will fall down. And it's quite the reverse. Quite the reverse, actually. And I think history's on my side and data's on my side too.
It's a refreshing view to hear. The final question that I have for you is that in reading the book, I felt like there was an undercurrent where when you look at these waves of progress throughout history, You seem to also bring up an opening up in terms of inclusion, and growth comes with it more tolerance. And I found that interesting that it came up at different points in the book. Can you just talk about why that's important to you?
Well, it's inclusion and diversity to me are some of the single most important things that I focus on in life, I think. In particular, as a leader, I've always believed that leaders only have to focus on two things. One is the purpose, why they're there, and the other one is how to include everybody in what they're doing. And if they can't do that, then they will surely fail as leaders, whether that's in politics or corporate life. And so inclusion is, I think, the ultimate test of human rights. I believe it's the thing that gets more things done because you can move people to work in teams together. If they, in a corporate setting, if they come to work as themselves, as opposed to some person that other people want to see, they will surely do better and be better parts of a team. I say that from my own personal experience as someone who was outed as gay when I was 60. It changed my life. I thought it would destroy my life. Actually, quite the reverse. It made it much, much better. In terms of the engineering, everything we're doing today democratizes more and more things. I know the internet creates also balkanization. So if you want to blow up a building or something, you sure can get together with people of a like mind somewhere in the dark web. But actually, it does other things as well. It opens up choice, it opens up information, it opens up the way we talk to each other. That's important. I think automation or the real digitalization of some medical practices allow them to be much more widespread than they were. For example, even today, ophthalmology, eye doctors can look at glaucoma, in my case, and they can be fully diagnosed with machines and learning algorithms. The very expensive doctor becomes the very small end of the chain. Point is, if she or he is not there, it still means that for almost everybody else, this can be spread out and democratized. So I think there are plenty of things that make it possible. This wave of moving more people in is absolutely with us. The negative side of it is, of course, is incipient nationalism and a sense that maybe growth is all over in some parts of the world, so people fight over a finite pie and say, if you have it, it's not mine and I want it. And that creates a nationalistic fervour that we see rising in some countries, not all. But it's a danger. In this area, I always think constant vigilance is needed. So it's underlying, I think it underlies my thinking, and so I'm pleased it comes through.
It came through especially, there's a little anecdote about it. I think it's a 15th century book that talks about travel, and it's about transportation, but even there you talk about how the observations have to do with being unsure about new cultures, but still admiring the humanity in them.
It was a remarkable book. It's a book I own a copy of this rare book, and it's when you go traveling nowadays, we just take a phone and we load up the cloud with yet another set of pictures of places everyone's been to. So we're using more and more precious space. But in the olden days, if you were very wealthy, you took your own artist, and they would draw what you saw. And this book is a travelogue of a crusade, and they go to all the important places of the world. And the reason I love the book is this: that it talks about different people, but not on a comparative basis to the Venetians and the Germans who were on the journey, but in a very open way. That we're interested to find out more about these people. But the lovely bit about the book is it has the single largest woodcut of Venice from the 15th century. And it's about 3 meters long, and it folds out, and you can look at it and you say, well, nothing's changed, which is true. Nothing has changed.
Wonderful. On that note, open it up. I think some people are eager for questions.
I think you're speaking to a choir, Lord. My question is, what about hackers? They can, I know you would also, there must be safeguards, but there are people who can hack into nuclear power stations, down planes. They are re-engineering the future. So how would you, prevent that?
Of course. But there are many, many examples of this, which is you have to engineer around it. You find it, you do it, you engineer around. In the case of, as you know, security, today's friend could be tomorrow's enemy and vice versa. So nothing is for sure. So you have to layer on every system layers of protection. It's the so-called Swiss cheese approach. Every layer has a hole in it, but the more slices of Swiss cheese you put on top of each other, the holes eventually go. So this is the technique that everybody uses, and indeed wise people do. You can't engineer the system perfectly, believing the intent of the builder, because the intent may change. So, I'm actually, in my own experience, right in the middle of this. I chair Huawei Technologies UK, and we are in the middle of Huawei as a company is a gigantic tech football between the US and China. And the question is it really true that Huawei is a security risk? The answer is probably not today, but it might be tomorrow. But I would argue, is AT&T a security risk? Not today, but could be tomorrow. So the answer you have to do is to look to see what you can do to layer it over. Otherwise, anyone who's controlling a nuclear power station, or come to think about, how about a drone? Or even, how about a hospital? How about the intensive care units full of machines? You can trust nothing. And so I've always been a believer in taking precautions, but carrying on doing things.
Hello. To mention a quote that's used very often these days, if data is the new oil, then we are extremely rich country. And has the train already left the station because Facebook and Google already has a huge bulk of data, or is it hopefully very early days? And therefore, is there a way that as a country, I'm not sure whether you look at it on an individual basis or as a country, and like Norway created a terrific sovereign fund, just ideas on what India could do, because there is no question that it's extremely rich in data. And sure, as we all know, without that data, a lot of these technologies can't fructify.
So I think there's obviously a separation between data science, and then ultimately, all the algorithms that go on top of it. But I think one of the very big advances in the future has to be about human beings and data, and it's about healthcare and diagnosis and even prognosis of what's going to happen. You need gigantic data for this, and fortunately in my own country also, we have gigantic data on this. We've been collecting it for a very long time. But you have to collect a lot of data. You have to collect data on individuals, like where do you live? Do you smoke? Do you exercise? Tell me about your gene sequencing, but also tell me about your primary care, secondary care, how many operations you've had. By the time you collect all this data together, chances are we can begin to understand how to really diagnose people at high degrees of probability without actually using the number of physicians we need to use today. Because I don't think that primary and secondary care can actually keep up with demands, because the richer nations become, the more people are interested in their own well-being. and the demands are gigantic, as you see in the United States, which is an incredibly rich country, which now spends 17% of GDP, I think, on healthcare. The UK couldn't do that. India couldn't do that, I don't think. But we need to figure out different ways of doing it. So I think that's a great thing to do. There's plenty of other data. I think it's not the new oil. Oil is, a fundamental that keeps you going. It's really just a subset of energy. Data is something very different. And if I may say so, I've never believed in the phrase, software will eat the world. I think that's nonsense. Because, and I say this, having sat on the board of Intel Corporation for a long time, no one, I'm sure in this room, everybody knows the cloud isn't actually the cloud. Exactly, exactly. It is, but all the big data is on big machines. And we've had 60 years of fantastic development of big machines, big memory, and we need that to keep going. Otherwise, software will certainly not eat the world. But I say that to TCS because I think TCS understand it fully.
Hello.
Hello. Yes.
Good evening, sir. I am Prithav Bang from NMIMS University. Sir, India was once the fastest growing economy in the world, and as recently as 24 hours before, the industrial growth of India came down to an 8-year low to a 1.3% in the August this year. Sir, how can you think innovation can help India to come out of this situation?
Well, you have to be very careful, I think, with looking at... I'm sitting next door to an economist. I'm going to be very sensitive.
I feel relieved for once I don't have to answer this question.
As a business person, I tend to look at things and say, yep, things change year to year, but let's start looking at the fundamentals here. So if you look at India, I sit on the board of IHS Markit, for example. And I was in Bangalore yesterday, and I went to see their division there. They've got a big division in Delhi as well. It's like everybody else. The brains there are gigantic. I keep thinking that maybe most of these companies have sales operations in the West and the brains in India. And it's kind of works a bit like that in some ways. Someone told me, is there anyone from IBM here? I think IBM has maybe half their entire staff in India, 150,000 people, I believe. So my main point in saying that is well-trained, well-organized brains will always win. They'll always win. They'll always will. There'll be interruptions because of trade. There are trade wars, technology wars. The US is trying to figure out where, does it really feel that it's being exploited through globalization? Wants to turn the clock back a bit, maybe a long way, who knows? They also worry about, and we have to worry because the US is so big, about the question of who owns the technology. I think that's really concerning the US. Ever since Sputnik, they've had a doctrine of being number one in engineered products to do with communications, security, defense. So AI, it's very difficult for one nation to own that, I believe, and even the kit that goes behind that, 5G, 6G even now with this new satellite systems. There are plenty of things where we're in a world, whatever we do with globalization, we'll actually have different people leading in different areas. And India's got an incredible resource to do that. I was just saying before we sat down to talk to each other, had I been much younger, I might have come here. If I were today, I would come here and figure out what to do. But it's a little bit too late for me now.
We have technology in Kerala, which makes you young.
Ah, yes, I know. I've actually been there.
You mentioned at the beginning of your talk that you talk about this painting.
Yes. So this painting, let me say immediately, this is on the edition of the book that isn't sold in the United States. In the US, the cover of this book is a microprocessor because it says everything you need to know about the book, apparently. I think this does. This is a painting by a Dutch artist called Vermeer, who only painted about 30 paintings in his entire life. So, and it's a painting of something called the geographer. And the model here is a person who was a microscopist, a model for this. But the point about this is, so first it's many things integrated, and in my book I talk a lot about integrated activity. There's no point in being just one thing, you've got to integrate more. And secondly, he's measuring, and he's got the world up above his head, and he's looking to the future. So I thought that was an ideal metaphor for what we were doing here. Plus also, it's highly detailed. He only painted 32 paintings, I think, but he took so long doing them. So that's the story of Vermeer.
I think on that note, perhaps we can move to the next stage, which is that we have some books here available to buy, and Lord Browne is generously said that he would stay for some time and sign some books. So please, as I said, I really enjoyed reading the book. Take the time, and we would love to have you stay with us to sign.
Well, thank you for listening to us. Thank you very much.